Okay, questions, comments?
I just want to know your thought on policy responses to automation, policies such as like the robot tax or like universal basic income. Do you think they could compensate the workers in long term?
Oh, robot tax. I don't know. I mean, you could simply increase corporate tax. Why should you just tax robots? Huh? No, because the dividing line between robots and machines is actually very unclear. Huh? So at what point the machine becomes a robot? Does it have to have a human face? It's a very tricky concept. Huh? Yeah, so if you want more money to compensate the workers, yes, I mean, you can increase corporation tax. I mean, if you tax only robots, that will, necessarily slow down the progress of technologies on that front. That's not necessarily a good thing. Of course, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, the society can collectively make a decision that we are going to deliberately slow down these technologies for whatever social, ethical, political reasons. But I mean, that needs a much more kind of sophisticated, deliberative process than simply slapping robot tax. Now, about the universal basic income, that's what you had in Play a Piano, isn't it? Yeah? No one had a job, but everyone had a good income. Yeah? Does it make us happy? No. Yeah? On top of that, whether universal basic income is a good idea or not is very dependent on what form it takes. Yeah? Because there is this libertarian form of universal basic income, which actually was advocated by Hayek and Friedman, which basically means that, yeah, you get some guaranteed minimum income, but not enough to give you a decent standard of living. At the same time, because you are getting that, they are going to abolish the welfare state. Yeah? If universal basic income takes that form, I'm 120% against it. Yeah? If it's this used as a supplement to the welfare state, basically because I think there's some point in people arguing that the current welfare state structure is too rigid. Yeah? There are too many kind of conditions. Yeah? You have to be unemployed, disabled, and so on. So you, by introducing increasing the cash element of your entitlement, you could give people a bit more flexibility. Huh? If it's that kind of basic income as a supplement to the bigger welfare state structure, fine. Yeah? We can debate that. Yeah? So universal basic income sounds great, but you really need to be clear about what it actually means. Yeah? Then we can agree or disagree or debate. Yeah?
You spoke pretty optimistically that you feel that in the long run, automation doesn't need to lead to long-term unemployment or even lower wages. You base that on the second industrial revolution, where you said wages didn't seem to be negatively affected. I just wonder, that historical example, at that time, it was only a very small part of the world that was industrializing, automating quickly. And also at that same time, huge amounts of wealth were being sucked from the rest of the world into that industrializing, automating period. So people often use this example. They say second industrial revolution, wages in Britain did well. But you probably know better than me. I just wonder what wages in India and China were doing at the time, and whether this paints perhaps an unrealistic picture of the long-term consequences of industrialization.
No, that's true. I mean, during the period of imperialism and colonialism, many third world countries, what are third world countries today, they experience a fall in living standard. I mean, average growth rate of China between mid-19th century and mid-20th century was something like negative 0.1%. I mean, the colonial authorities created untold miseries. I mean, one of the governors of India, Lord Bentinck, once described this scene where the weavers in Bengal were starved to death because the British flooded the market with machine-manufactured textile, and the horizon was dotted with white bones of these dead weavers. You know? So yes, I mean, it's great that you have brought our attention to that bigger picture. And yeah, even though eventually, this was sorted out, as I mentioned earlier, what about the misery and destitution and hopelessness that people experience in the period of 3 years, 5 years, maybe even longer of technological unemployment? I'm not saying that this time will be like the last time. I'm not saying that the last time was great. But what I am certain is that this process can be made to work at least better. Yeah? Because, as I was also trying to argue during my lecture on globalization, there's this deep-seated belief that whatever is related to technology is beyond our control. Yeah? We cannot possibly argue against it. Yeah? We cannot control it. No, we can. Yeah? And I've actually discussed quite a lot of ways in which we can deliberately slow down the progress of certain technologies, channel technological progress into certain things, better compensate the losers from the process, and so on. So, I mean, my main message is that yes, there are many ways that we can shape this process. We may not completely get rid of the victims, but we can do a lot better if we are aware that the process of technological progress can be politically, socially, even ethically controlled, and they have to be. Huh?
So you spoke about the embeddedness between politics and technology, and I thought about bureaucracy and the automation of bureaucracy. And to what extent do you think it should be or it can be automated? Because nobody talks about the automation of bureaucratic jobs that to some extent seem quite useless or semi-useless in some aspects.
Yeah. Well, unlike many other people, I believe that bureaucracy is a foundation of modern civilization. Eh? So you need bureaucracy, but yes, I mean, there are some elements that are kind of quite routine and don't necessarily need human presence. Yeah, so we can automate those bits. Now, of course, this opens up the danger that people can get just lost in the system because somehow they filled in the form wrongly and there's no one to talk to. And no, I mean, we are already experiencing it, yeah? I mean, for some services, you have to be on the phone like 30 minutes or press 75 buttons before you can talk to anyone who then says, it's not my responsibility, I'm going to transfer you to some other person, then make you wait for another 20 minutes. Yeah? It's already happening, but yes, I mean, I think in an ideal world, the wish is that machines do the boring things and humans do interesting things. Yeah? I mean, can we find a way to introduce automation and machine learning and artificial intelligence to make that happen? Well, of course, there are a huge range of challenges there, but I think that's the direction we have to think about. I mean, is this technology going to make human life better in some sense, more interesting, more meaningful? Yeah, and I mean, of course, those things have to be to an extent compatible with the need for corporations to make profit, and there has to be some material incentives to various people involved in the process. But at the moment, we are basically looking at only the second group of things. We are not asking questions. I mean, some people do, like Elon Musk and the small number of people have raised questions of that nature, but it's basically too much driven by the engineering mind. Can we do it? Can we produce a robot that can do this, do that? Beat the chess master, beat the Go master, and the profit the motive. Can we make more money? Never mind the workers. They'll somehow survive. We want to make more money. So too much decisions are made on those bases. I'm not saying that those are irrelevant or wrong, but there are these bigger questions, more difficult questions that we need to keep asking, and they are not being asked.
I was just wondering, with regard to connecting automation to inequality, do you think that there's also kind of a darker scenario where there is a large scale automation, but those machines belong to a elite who have those machines, but then we don't actually manage to create that better scenario where we all do meaningful work. There's kind of these two different scenarios where we do meaningful work and let machines do the boring things, or we have the machines take over, do the work for, let's say, the elite, and everyone else is kind of left behind even more.
No, I mean both those things are going to happen. Both those things have been already happening. A lot of mechanization was to make the human muscle power unnecessary. And those who introduced those technologies may not have the welfare of the workers in mind, but that as a result, people are doing far less physically onerous jobs. Let me tell you an incredible story how substitutable the humans are for machines. I mean, I have this friend who grew up in this alleged country called Siskai. This was one of the sort of Bantustan countries that the apartheid regime created within its own border, pretending that they respected the Africans, and so he grew up there. I mean, it was a very poor part of South Africa, although as a white person he had a good life. He said the area he used to live had these little boys riding on the bus, working for the bus company, with a pile of bricks. So I said, pile of bricks? What do they do? Apparently, these boys were used to work as a human brakes to the bus. The bus company couldn't be bothered to buy new brakes. So when the bus needed to slow down, the driver will tell the boy, get out. He jumps out with a pile of bricks, lays the bricks on the path of the bus. That will eventually make the bus stop. Yeah, so without brakes, you will have to do something like that, using human labor, if you want to run at more than the speed of a, say, ox cart. So yes, the inventing brakes and the fork lanes and the pneumatic drills. I mean, these are great things. I mean, people don't have to break their back to earn a living. So you can think along the line. I mean, what are the things that we actually don't want to do? Because it's physically dangerous or too hard or too boring, too repetitive. Can we develop technologies that can liberate us from these? So that's one front you have to push. The other one is, yes, I mean, there are the consequences of these automation technologies, because as you said, I mean, you could imagine a world, I mean, even play a piano wasn't like that, but in theory, you could have a world where one guy owns all the machines and everyone is unemployed. But actually, that world will have a huge economic problem, because there's this quite famous anecdote. I forget their names, but in the 1950s and 60s, there was this very powerful union boss in Ford motor cars in America. One day, the then CEO of Ford Motor Car takes him to this new factory and shows him all these new automated machines, telling him, haha, where are you going to get your union members now? Yeah? You are finished. Yeah? But the union guy said, haha, where are you going to sell the cars to? There'll be no one to buy your cars if you only have machines. Yeah? Yeah, so in that kind of world, you will have a huge demand problem. Yeah? Because you produce all these cars, the machines that the robots cannot buy the cars, you have to sell them to someone. So you have to give them some income. Yeah? How are you going to do it? I mean, if you do it in the way of play a piano, people might have money, but they'll be miserable. So actually, you need to create a society where people can do meaningful things. Yeah? So both these, in the end, lead to, if you like, the philosophical dimension, the ethical dimension. Yeah? What is human life about? Yeah? What is a good life? What is a good society? Yeah? Without thinking about this, making something simply because it can be done, that's the engineering mindset. Simply because it makes money, that's the business mindset. That's not enough. Yeah?
To what extent is automation linked to mass production? Because it needs to be economically viable and to actually invest in these machines, so they need to produce a certain...
Yeah, right at the beginning, I mean, this was very closely related to automation, mass production was, yeah? Because the automation technologies were very expensive. They were very specific. They couldn't be easily reprogrammed. So if you build a production line for a certain model of cars, that was more or less the only thing that it could produce. Yeah? So it had very high asset specificity in the language that I introduced earlier. Subsequently, the technologies have developed to de-link the automation from mass production, not completely, of course, but to quite an extent. I mean, the one important development was the development of automobile production technologies by the Japanese companies in the 1980s, where they introduced a lot of reprogrammable things and interchangeable parts and so on, so that one production line could be just changed over to another within half a day. Yeah? So, the technologies become less dedicated, less linked to mass production, high volume production. So, yeah, I mean, it is not inconceivable that the linking will progress even further. But it wouldn't be complete because however you do it, I mean, these machines are going to be very expensive. Yeah? If you use expensive machines, whether they are called robots or not, if you use expensive machines, you need to produce a lot in volume. Yeah? Otherwise, the unit cost will shoot through the roof. Yeah? So the more expensive your machines are, the more specific the machines are, you need to increase the volume. Yeah? So there's that fundamental economic logic. But yeah, compared to, say, the 1920s when Henry Ford invented the conveyor belt system, mass production and automation has been de-linked quite substantially.
This might be a bit tangential, but I've been just thinking, since we're discussing robotics, etc., the trend I'm seeing these days, as well as other people, is a lot of businesses are, there's initial business model through which, empowered by machine learning, online platform, etc., they gather data from millions or even something billion people these days, and then data has transformed itself into another very modern form of capital almost, because
I see.
it leads
Yeah,
to
yeah.
another set of value chains. So I've been just thinking, if this trend increases as well as keeps on going, a business started in small volume it puts in motion its initial business model, after which it gathers data and keeps accumulating wealth, which increases exponentially. Would it lead to some form of inequality that we haven't yet observed?
Right. No, that's something that I haven't even realized existed. But yes, I mean, any form of concentration is likely to increase inequality. But once again, I mean, hopefully we'll have a lecture on inequality in the second installment of the lecture series. But inequality is once again not beyond human control. One very interesting piece of statistics is if you go to the OECD website and look at their income inequality data, they produce two, well, I mean, actually many, but two of the Gini coefficients they produce are one before tax and transfer and another after tax and transfer. If you look at the before tax and transfer Gini coefficient, many European countries, Sweden, Belgium, France, Germany, depending on the year, is more unequal than the United States. But they tax and redistribute so much, after this, they become far more equal than the United States. So actually, inequality is not a natural phenomenon. So we are actually we have two big kind of political steps that we can take. One is from technology to inequality. You can control technology politically to influence inequality. I mean, when I say control technology, I just don't mean controlling the technological innovation process, but how it's deployed, how the displaced workers are treated, and so on. Yeah? And from inequality produced by the sort of market process, you also can control it through various the tax and transfer programs, and also the programs producing weaker economic agents like small farmers and small shops and small companies to finally produce an inequality outcome that is very different from what the market has given you. So, there's a huge range of things from technology to inequality. So yes, I mean, if you don't do anything, these technological progresses are likely to lead to heightened inequality, but that's not an inevitable outcome. You cannot completely control the process, so you may see some increase in inequality, but the usual talk is as if these technologies are happening. We cannot do anything. Inequality will shoot through the roof. No, that's not true.
Now, related with the last argument or the last question, if we concentrated more in the first step, technology change and inequality, what kind of policies, if we decide, for example, what kind of automatization we want in our society, what kind of policies we can make to drive this technological change, this automation to the thing that we want, given that technology progress is owned by companies and by firms that not maximize the welfare society, maximize.
Sure. No, but you can't significantly control this process because first of all, in most countries where there's research and development, because many poor developing countries don't do any R&D at all. But in countries where it is done, governments fund a very significant part of this research. So at the height of the Cold War, because it was pouring so much money into defense-related research, which have produced the computer, internet, and semiconductor, and so on, the U.S. government in some years was the financing up to 2/3 of total national R&D. Yeah, if you are controlling 2/3 of technology funding, yeah, you can very significantly determine what kind of technologies are developed. Now, today this has fallen to just below 40% in America, but it's still a huge chunk. I mean, in most other rich countries, it may not be necessarily as high as that, but at least 25% are controlled by the government. In some countries, it could be 60%. Yeah? So actually, the government has a big say in what kind of technologies are developed. Secondly, the government can introduce regulations. Yeah? You can say, well, these technologies are not allowed, yeah? Period. Yeah? Or we mandate that these technologies are introduced by any firm with more than 500 workers, say technologies that reduce physically dangerous labor. Yeah? Yeah, that will significantly affect what kind of technologies are developed. Yeah? Yeah, and then you can use more fine-tuned instruments like different tax rates for different types of technologies. I mean, this universal robot tax might be too blunt, but I can see how you might have more fine-tuned tax system that encourages and discourages certain types of technological progress. Yeah? So there are lots of things that government can do. The trouble is that we are not having the basic conversation. Yeah? We are not having a conversation on why we are developing these technologies, yeah? And what will be good for the society, what kind of society we eventually want. Yeah? Without that debate, yeah, I mean, what would the government do? I mean, it has the tools, but since it doesn't know what it is supposed to do, it cannot use those tools. So we need that fundamental debate.
It seems that some of the countries are using more of the artificial intelligence and more automation. Yeah. And would that, in the long term at least, impact the redistribution of wealth and poverty of nations? Because it seems that during the late industrial revolution, we got a completely different picture of some countries going forward, some staying behind. And with this artificial intelligence, easier globalization argument, would you predict a different picture on the global sort of income poverty scale, like maybe in 10, 20 years?
Broadly speaking, this is likely to increase disparities between countries. Because these technologies that countries like Korea, Singapore, Germany, Sweden are leading in adopting, they are quite difficult technologies. So if those technologies become more important, lots of other countries that do not use those technologies are likely to fall behind. But that's a statement of very broad principle, because you can make those technologies more accessible to other countries. I mean, the rich countries can transfer these technologies for free to developing countries. Well, in theory, I mean, they would, in practice, not do it, but it is possible. And also, I'm not so sure how fast these technologies will develop, because usually, whichever technology that we are talking about, technologies develop in a very kind of unpredictable way. So sometimes you have very rapid progress due to some breakthrough for a period, and then it stagnates, and it might disappear or might get revived 3-4 years later and have another leap and so on. So it's not clear that whether this robot, artificial intelligence, they are going to become so significant and so impactful that it's going to change the basic architecture of the global economy in the near future. I'm sure in the very long run it will happen, but it's very difficult to tell whether the main impacts are going to be seen in the next 20 years or 50 years or 100 years. And maybe in 100 years we wouldn't even be able to use these technologies because of climate change and some natural disasters, and we go back to subsistence farming. So, yeah, but I mean, I basically see technology as a potentially very positive force. I mean, of course, it can be abused, it can be misused, and so on. But without those technological progresses made in the last 2-3 centuries, we wouldn't even be able to have this lecture. So, mildly optimistic prediction for the future, but the main point is that we need to work very hard to shape the future and create a better society. We cannot just let it happen to us. Okay.